Okay, I have a plate here. It's a city at sunset. Notice as I scrub through the movie, the boats are moving through the water. And notice that the camera is not moving at all. So this is what we call a locked off shot. The camera is locked off and it doesn't move. So our assignment for this matte painting is going to be to make this city kind of a futuristic city. We'll make it a metropolis that's quite a bit bigger. And finally we'll put a moving camera in it. We'll make it a 3D matte painting. We'll utilize the primarily the waterfront and all the boats in the water, and we'll use those moving elements, and we'll show you how to match those elements into the matte painting and get everything moving with a 3D camera map. So I took some of these buildings from another shot. This is a good way to start. Basically, they share some similar lighting. As you can tell, it's not the exact lighting, but some similar lighting. It's kind of a sunset time of day. And I'm just going to extract them and get rid of that sky. Try and put these buildings back in there inside of our main plate. So one of the first things you'll notice is that the perspective is going to be off a little bit. So we'll try and distort this image and try and match the perspective of the plate. So I'm just going to grab a few guidelines because it looks like some of these vertical lines in the plate are actually almost perfectly vertical. And I can use them as a guideline to line up the buildings from the other photograph. Use it as a mat so that I can drop the new buildings in behind these foreground buildings in the plate. I'm just going to group that and call it towers, color code it yellow, and give it a bit of transparency just to mimic what it might look like with a little more atmospheric perspective over top of it. A little more haze. So I'm just going to scale it down a little bit. Moving the center point of that scale transform allows me to scale the image upon that point. I'm just looking at the windows, trying to make sure that the scale isn't too far off between the windows in the photograph and the windows in the plate. Also, while I'm doing this, I'm just trying to find a nice composition. So it still needs a little bit more atmosphere. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to the plate and come make a copy of it, put it above the photograph, and group it with the photograph so it's instantly matted with that photo. Now, if I give it a little bit of transparency, put it down to about 8%, you can play around with the transform modes. And it starts to look fairly realistic in lighten and with an opacity of 21 or so. That's something we might want to continue tweaking as the shot goes on. But you can see really quickly that what you can do is make a copy of the plate and pull some of those colors, that nice gradation, into the new elements. So I'll do the same thing, but this time I'm just going to keep it contained to the left side of the plate, of the photograph. And I'm just going to do a little bit of reorganizing here. And now, since this shot is going to be a 2-3-5 shot, I may as well start early on and consider the framing as we're considering the composition of the whole shot. So with this black crop layer at the top, it's just going to hide everything that's outside of our 2-3-5 region. Now I think what the shot needs is a larger, more dominant skyscraper over near the left to balance out the entire city. So I'm just going to make a copy of this so that I can use some of the texture from it, scale it around, and I have my eye on that center building. Just going to try and quickly map this out and see if I can use any part of it for this building I'm going to sketch in. So I want this building to be a little bit more unique, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it up out of a little bit of paint and a little bit of parts, and just see what I can come up with for a unique kind of form. Something a little bit on the exotic, kind of futuristic side. So if I just start outlining a form, it's really kind of just a freehand with a straight line tool, with the lasso tool. Something that has a very tall spire on the top, tapers. Compositionally, something that kind of works with what we've already established. Just fill it with a dark color, something that's taken from any one of the darker regions of one of these other buildings. And just kind of play around with the form, slide it around. Every once in a while, just squint at it. Using the squint test helps to see what the form might look like, even though it's very plain. Kind of fools your eye into looking at everything, thinking that everything is simplified. So I'm just copying around some texture from the other buildings and making up my own little design. Something that has a very vertical feel. Try to get those windows segmented so that they're kind of stacked very, very tall. And get rid of part of that spire. It's a little bit. Photorealistic. It's not realistic. Okay, so let's move on. We can always come back to those elements. So it kind of feels like the city needs some more buildings in the background behind these towers. So I'm just going to mass in a bunch of blocks. Fill it with some color. Again, just some darker color that's found in one of the foreground buildings. Anything will really suffice. And again, I'm just looking for something that compositionally is going to read well. Fill the frame, tell the story that this city is sometime in the future. It's quite dense. Feels a little bit like New York, but it's obviously not. Now by choosing some of the buildings, we can haze them back just by curving them or giving them more transparency, just so that there's more depth in there. So already you can see very quickly we have 4 layers of depth just within the buildings. So I'm just going to go through and name these really quickly just to keep somewhat organized. We'll call this the Hero Tower. And so let's get on to detailing some of these buildings just so that they're not plain blocks back there. So I'm just going to pull some values from these adjacent buildings and start sketching in a little bit of form. Add some junk to the rooftops, a little bit of mechanical. Give it a darker edge on the building there so that it looks like it has a side, and some lighter vertical lines. Some of these Asian buildings in Hong Kong are popular for having some of these cross braces that are very prominent on the outside of the building, so I kind of like that look, so we'll kind of go with that look here. Really at this point I'm just looking for a little bit of visual noise to add to these blocks in the background. In the end, I don't want to spend too much time on them, just because they may be covered up by other elements as I develop this. But for the meantime, spending a couple minutes sketching on over top of them won't hurt, and it might trigger new ideas for composition or even building designs. So again, just pulling colors from the foreground buildings. This time I'm pulling some of the building lights, the illuminated windows. There's some nice values in there, so if we add a little bit of that type of noise back in there, it might help it to sit back in the distance and not look like a big flat card. So really, the ultimate goal for this painting is it's going to be about a 1K painting. So, as with a lot of these shots that I'm doing for we do the same thing for film. The only difference really is that we typically have an output of 2K for film, and so often we'll work at 4K, which is double, and it allows some of our little painterly brush strokes to shrink down and look more realistic. But even oftentimes we do create the artwork at 2K or 3K, but as low as 2K, even for a 2K output. So these plates being high definition, they we're going to want to make sure that we take into consideration that it does need to be a little bit softer. So as we continue to put some texture in the forms in the background, just need to be careful of a few things. Since the buildings in the background are hazed back a lot more, we are implying that they're farther away. Therefore, if we're going to use any of this texture from the foreground buildings, we should be sure to scale it down so that it follows the idea that they are farther away. So we'll do one more building here on the right. Same technique. Let's try and get some horizontal lines on this one. So I should note that it is important to keep a lot of these buildings on their separate layers, because that's going to be key later on when we go to start camera mapping this shot. Because we're going to want parallax between all of these layers, we'll want to keep at least a significant amount, maybe 4 or 5 different building layers. Now what I have in mind for a camera move is a camera move that flies pretty much straight ahead. Imagine we're in a helicopter, and as we fly in, we approach the city. Some of the boats are going to fly in under us, and we're going to approach the city, and there's going to be parallax that's noticeable because we're probably flying somewhere in the realm of about 100 feet forward. So I'm just going to clean up some of these edges. Some of the brighter edges that came from the previous sky are a little bit distracting. Obviously, I'm not going to finesse all the edges right now and make them perfect, just because I might want to make some major changes first. But here and there where it's obviously distracting, we can clean it up. Now with this main building, I think it needs a little bit of a tweak regarding its design, so let's see if we can move parts of it around a little bit and just try and make it look a little more futuristic. Tweak the haze a little bit. So I'm just grabbing the plate as I've done before and copying it, pasting it over top of this hero building, grouping it together so it's matted, and using about 25%, we haze it back. Now near the bottom, if I draw a soft matte, I can darken it down a little bit. So I'm darkening down that copy of the plate, give it a little bit of a shadow at the bottom, just a subtle shadow. Okay, so I'm just going to go over to the left-hand side and start sketching in some groupings of buildings that I'm going to use in the far background. Right now I'm just going to work on their form with relationship to each other. So it's a little bit on the big side, but I'm just trying to get each building that I paint back there to look nice with the building beside it. Some of the bridges between them are kind of nice. And at this scale, it's just easier to paint the bridges a little larger. What I'll do in a minute here is I'll try and play around with their scale just to make them match the rest of the city a little bit better. I am painting on its own layer, so it's not difficult at all to tweak the scale or position of all these buildings. So again, if you sit back and use the squint test, you can start to see the city massing come along. Thinking in terms of composition, I just want to have something that fills up the background there. Feels like there's lots and lots of buildings that have been built through the years. But they're far enough away that we're not going to have to get into detailing every single one of them, which is certainly a time-consuming task. Taking cues from the amount of haze in the plate, both on the extreme left side and the right side, you can see back there in the distance, there's possibly some type of hills or mountains that are barely legible. That's because it is so thick and hazy in this plate. Over on the right side, you see the mountain that I'm talking about. I guess it's more of a hill than a mountain, but you get the idea. So anytime a plate is full of atmosphere like this one is, it's a really great opportunity for a beautiful matte painting. In my opinion, some of my favorite matte paintings, some of the best matte paintings around are the ones that have very dramatic atmosphere, and it makes for beautiful lighting scenarios, typically beautiful color palettes, and certainly a lot of depth. So if you have that opportunity to work with plates like this, I definitely would encourage it. It's a lot of fun to play with what the light does to objects as they recede into the really hazy atmosphere, as well as to some degree it simplifies the job because you only have to imply the forms in the background. You don't have to worry about painting more detail. So I just made a copy of that small cluster of buildings from the left and shot it over to the right hand side. Again, we're just trying to make this fill this area up. It was a little bit on the transparent side, so I duplicated it over itself and it doubled itself up so it became darker. So it looked a little closer. Now it looks a little closer than the cluster on the far left. Enough that we can start investigating how it looks in a 3D environment. So I'm just going to start merging things together. These far buildings, put them all together in their own group, in their own texture map. The sky, flatten a copy of just the sky and save it out as texture map, as a TIFF. This will be the only texture map that does not need an alpha channel, simply because there's nothing to cut out. And then I'll go on to splitting out the rest of the layers with the according alpha channels. You'll see that I use an action that will multiply my edges here in Photoshop right just before I save my texture out as a TIFF. What that does is it helps to avoid any problems cutting the image out and unpremultiplying them with black, which is a common problem that you can have within a max shader. So when it's complete, we'll just save it, and that'll be about it. We'll move on to the next chapter and start camera mapping the scene.